Dr. Slater obtained her DVM from Cornell University in 1986, but we don't hold that against her. She spent a year in small animal practice and then got a PhD in epidemiology, also at Cornell. She was on the faculty at Texas A&M until 2008 when she joined the ASPCA. She's internationally recognized for her work on the sources, problems, and potential solutions for free-roaming cats and dogs, and currently works as a staff epidemiologist and provides statistical support for the research division of the ASPCA. Her present projects range from community cat solutions to identifying the capacity of horse rescues to what services increase pet retention in underserved neighborhoods. And I believe that's what we're mostly going to hear about today. So,
cool.
Thank you very much. Please
Thanks.
welcome Dr. Slater.
It's great to be here. So I'm remote, so I'm just in Northampton, so I just kind of trumanicked over here, so it's great to be here. And it's nice to see such a great turnout. So I'm going to give you kind of a smorgasbord of a handful of research projects that we've done in the last few years that look at rehoming, placing pets from one home or source to another. That's sort of the generic term we use, where a pet leaves a home and goes somewhere else. And relinquishment, which is what we typically talk about when we say a pet leaves a home and goes to a shelter. And then a little bit about some other projects. And I just want to acknowledge that I'm presenting this, but there's a whole slew of people who've been involved in this research over the last couple of years. So we've got some national rehoming data that I'm going to show you. And we have some information on relinquishment in specific cities. So that's relinquishment to the shelter. And then we also have, the ASPCA does a number of programs that help prevent surrender to shelters and improve retention in the home. And I'm going to just give you some hot off the press data that we just finished analyzing this fall from New York City from one of their animal control centers and one of our programs there. So there's been a fair bit written about relinquishment, although actually a lot of it is older now from the 90s, which by your standards is probably dinosaur territory. But there's not a lot about rehoming. And when you look at some of the sources and surveys that say, where does people get their pets? Friends and family is pretty high up there. And for cats, strays is pretty high up there. And so this was a chance for us to get a handle on what's happening out there when they don't necessarily show up in the shelter. So this was a study that we did, a random phone survey. We used land and cell lines, so we got a nice broad cross-section. We reached about 12,000 people. About 10,000 of them had had a dog at present when we called them or within the last 5 years. And we did 5 years so that we didn't ask them to remember too far back. And then 590 of those people had rehomed one of those pets or more in the last 5 years. So that's 6% rehomed, changed homes to somewhere else in a 5-year time period. Just under 400 dog rehomers and just under 200 cat rehomers, so we were able to get a nice sample for both species. And curiously, there was no difference between dogs and cats for the reasons for rehoming. We were surprised about that, actually, or I was anyway. And most of these pets were spayed or neutered. They had pretty high spay-neuter rates, which was also interesting. So if you do the math and you look at how many pets there are in the US, it looks like about 6+ million households rehome a dog or a cat every 5 years. So that's a fair number. So where are they going? They're going to, let me see if I get this right. There we go. Primarily friends and family, and a fair number to the shelter. And some are rehomed to strangers through veterinarians. We had a few people admit that they set their cats free, and a few random other reasons. So that's where they went. We're still seeing a lot of this friends and family. So we broke it out and we said, well, what were the reasons for rehoming to the shelter? So the traditional relinquishment. And these are the buckets we put them into. This pet category includes things like behavior and aggression, the pet got too big, that kind of thing. And you can see when they came to the shelter, it was a lot of pet-related issues. That seems to be associated with that as a place where pets go. Whereas when they rehomed to friends and family, they had a lot more family reasons, things like divorces, new baby, somebody was allergic, Housing, they didn't allow pets, or the animal got too big for the housing, and then some pet-related issues. But the profile of the pets that were rehomed to the different places is different, which is interesting. We also looked at it by income, because we talk a lot about income and about patterns we believe happen. Some of them are true, some of them aren't. We divided it into less than $50,000 a year and more than that. And you'll see that the folks who have the higher income are more likely to be rehoming for pet-related reasons, and the folks with the lower income are more likely to be rehoming for cost and housing. And we haven't mentioned housing really a lot, but I know many of you have probably been in cities, and you know that finding places to live with your pets, as students, you know that, can be challenging. And in the big cities, I think it's even worse. So we dug in a little farther and looked at those who rented their housing, and for them, housing was the #1 reason they had to rehome a pet. They couldn't find a place to take their pet. And that's a nut we haven't cracked yet at the ASPCA, and I think in the animal welfare world. We're working on it. How do we get to people soon enough to help them with their housing needs? We know sometimes we get to them a little bit too late and they're already homeless, and they have an animal and they have no place to put their pet. So amongst the folks who had the lower income, we also said, what would have helped you keep your pet? And in that case, 40% said low cost or free veterinary care. So that's something I know that Tufts has got going on, and it's something that we're doing as well, and that's a big one for us. Behavior help, pet-friendly housing, spay-neuter, and then other kinds of pet care or temporary housing. So the bottom line is that a lot of these are things we can fix. If we can get to people soon enough, we can provide low-cost veterinary care. We can provide behavior help. So this to us was very encouraging, that a lot of the things that people needed to try and keep their pet were programs that we might be able to offer if we can figure out the right what and how to get it to people when they need it. So this is a little bit about a study that we published a while ago. And these were looking at, I'm just going to show a couple slides to make a couple of points here. So this was big dogs, because in a lot of cities, this was done in Washington, D.C. and in New York City. Big dogs come in, and those are the hard ones to get adopted. You're in a big city. So I just want to show you a couple things from this. This was, again, the what influenced relinquishment. And you can see this is New York City and D.C. It's a little different between the two, but some of these buckets should start to look familiar now. People issues, this is the family stuff, divorce, somebody didn't like the pet, allergies, moving, this is the housing stuff, moving and landlord. You can see we split these into two, but they're both there. Behavior, pet-related issues, behavior, and dog health and expenses. So again, this is interesting because it tells us that different cities are having different proportions of these different kinds of problems, but these general problems happen all over. The other thing is, and this is just one piece of data, a lot of different people surrender their pets to shelters. There's no single profile of who can't keep their pet and has to come to a shelter. In your given city, there may be a profile, but if you move to a different place and you're looking at doing this kind of programming, you need to find out who's coming to your shelter and why are they coming, because it's going to vary from place to place. As an example, we did some work in Los Angeles, and we said, okay, there's a lot of this angst and a lot of bad-mouthing sometimes of people who are poor. If they're poor, they shouldn't have pets. And yet we know that having pets is really important for people's health and welfare. So let's not say that anymore, and let's dig in and say, okay, what if we take income out of the picture? What happens then? Because we know that not all poor people surrender their pets, and not all rich people keep their pets. So this is a study we did in one of the city shelters in Los Angeles. Los Angeles is a little bit unusual in that they have mandatory spay-neuter, and they have proactive enforcement. People go door to door and knock and look for compliance and issue citations. And so we were interested in digging into what was going on in LA. We're doing a lot of work there, and we wanted to get a handle on it because we know that it's different from city to city. And we wanted to see what we can do to prevent relinquishment. So a couple years ago, we spent a few months, we had face-to-face interviewers in that shelter, and those were the relinquishing owners. And then to get a comparison group that took socioeconomic status out of the picture, we also talked to people who came to the low-cost spay-neuter clinic, which was housed in the same facility. So we were hoping to draw the same set of, from the same locations, the same kinds of people, but some folks had to relinquish and some folks were coming for spay-neuter. We looked at owner demographics, we looked at a bunch of dog demographics, and then we looked at things like stress in the household, attachment to the dog, expectations of the dog, and were they on public assistance. So what changed that led to relinquishment? Inability to pay for care, 67%, 2/3 of people. That's what changed. And again, you'll see these other buckets, but now they're at much lower levels. Landlord, behavior, moving, lack of time, that's the people stuff. New kids, that's people stuff. Turns out that over 80% of people didn't know there was some help they could get to keep their pet. And when they were told, 88% went and explored getting that help. So again, this starts to help us with this sort of stereotype that people come to shelters and they're bad people and they just want to dump off their pets. These are people who didn't know, but once they found out, were really keen to try and get services that would help them keep their pets. And in Los Angeles, because of mandatory spay-neuter, a lot of it is spay-neuter. And that's something that's like, we know how to fix that. That's easy. And that's what we're doing a lot of in Los Angeles. What wasn't different between the groups? So remember, this is a group of folks who are all from the same pretty poor area in LA City. How they expected the dog to behave was the same, how much work the dog was. A bunch of the demographics were the same between the groups, and a bunch of the dog demographics were the same between the groups. There was really not a lot of difference between these two groups. So then, what is it that led some people to have to surrender and others not to? What we did find was that there was more stress in the home, perceived stress in the home in the couple months before they had to surrender the pet. There was slightly less attachment, but it was really not a big difference. And the folks who had to surrender were more likely to be on public assistance. And this is after we've accounted for a bunch of the other demographic variables. This is out of a logistic regression model. So cost was a biggie for us. It was mentioned in almost 3/4 of all the responses. Some were just cost, but here it is again, this medical and spay-neuter. In LA, almost 60% of people needed help with that. And again, that's something we can fix. Housing pops up over here. Only 1/3 didn't mention cost, and there, housing was the biggie. Over half the people had issues with housing. So again, that's something we have to figure out how we can manage, because for some folks, that's a deal breaker. This is a group that might be comfortable with this, but I like to point out that this mandatory spay-neuter doesn't always lead to happy dogs sleeping on people's beds. Sometimes it has unintended consequences. And I know that LA is trying to get to be a no-kill city. That's what they're aiming for. But perhaps their mandatory spay-neuter isn't working the way they think the way they might like it to be. So this is I'm going to switch gears now. This is one of our retention programs. We have retention programs going on in LA and New York and in a couple other spots. This is about a particular set, which is what we call a medical grant. So these are folks who come in, are referred to us through various avenues, and they need medical help for their pet. Usually it's not spay-neuter, sometimes it's serious like pyometra or hit by car, but sometimes it's things like ears or eyes or skin stuff or vomiting, those kinds of medical things. And we're able to provide them with a referral either to our services or to veterinary partners in New York City. And so we did some follow-up on these folks, and I just want to share what we found because it was really powerful. We provide this money to a number of sources. The data that I'm going to show you is from our animal care centers, and it's primarily from the Brooklyn Animal Care Center. And we did it just earlier this year. We had, this program's been going on longer than that, 6 months, but that's where we did it, where we had initial questions that we asked people, and we called them back a month later and asked them some follow-up questions. And we were looking at retention in the home for a month, as well as some welfare and other kinds of things going on. And the questions, these initial questions were asked after they knew we were going to help them. So we were trying not to have them rig their answers. We were looking for some honesty. So the question here, how likely would you be to give up this pet if you didn't get the help we're going to be giving you? What would you say on a scale from 1 to 10, with 1 being extremely unlikely to give up and 10 being extremely likely to give up? And then if you couldn't get this help, what would you have done? These were initial questions that were asked when we said, yes, we're giving you money, we're giving you a referral to a veterinarian, we will help you get there, we will support you doing this. What do you tell us? So here's what we had. Remember, 10 is extremely likely, and 1 is extremely unlikely. So it was interesting that coming to the animal care centers in New York City, we still had almost 2/3 of people who really weren't coming intending to give up their pet. That was not their intention. They were coming there looking for help, which was fascinating. We did have about 1/3 who were likely to give up their pet if they couldn't get the help. They just wouldn't know where to go. You can see we have some stuff going on in the middle a little bit. We set a cutoff here based on some other data that we looked at. But the majority of people were pretty clear which end of the spectrum they fell. They were really coming for help. But then we said, well, what would you have done if you didn't get this help? Find other help, 40%. They didn't really have a clear idea of what they would do. This is where they came because they didn't know what else to do. Some people just said, I have no idea. Some people said, even though I don't want to surrender, these are people who said they don't want to give up their pet. 10% of them said they would surrender anyway, even though they really didn't come there looking to do that. Take the pet home, treat the pet themselves, euthanize the pet. So this tells us that there's not a lot of untapped resources in New York City that we're missing. We're pretty sure of that. But people really don't have a clear idea of where to go. And this has some substantial welfare implications because some of these animals really needed treatment now. And some of these diseases were things that are fatal. There were some foreign bodies, there were obstructed cats. But there's also things like chronic skin infections. And any of you who've ever had an itchy dog with a skin infection know that that's really brutal for the dog and the person. So this program, this kind of medical support, low cost, but this is actually usually free up to a point, is really important in improving animal welfare as well as retention in the home. So these are some of the quotes people said. When we said, if you couldn't get this help, what would you have done? And these are people who are not interested in giving up their pets. I do the best I can and try and start my own fundraiser or something. I want him to get surgery because I love him. I try to raise the money, care credit, family, anything but give her up. I try and see the client herself could clean it based on her human medical background. I would have doctored her myself at home. I would have kept him and held him until he died. These are people who love their pets. And that's something that has been hard for people in the animal welfare movement and sometimes the veterinary world to get behind. These are not people who are doing this haphazardly or for no good reason. It's not the my cat doesn't match the couch person that you hear about. These are people who really want to make a difference and they follow through and they get their pet help. So we called these folks a month later. We had 156 surveys. I've been a little bit vague on sample size. So we have 156 people that we had both those initial questions and follow-up on. And we had a 58% response rate. We were able to reach 58% of folks. Is the pet still living with you? Yes, 96%. We pick a month. It was not a random number, but it was not you could argue that retention in the home might be 2 months, but we picked 1 month because a lot of times things change after that, and we wanted this to really be a measure of the one event. And we figured, okay, if they got past that initial thing and the pet was still there a month later, then we got them over the hump. The 4%, one was relinquished to ACC, and one was given to a rescue. So of those 156 folks, only 2 of them ended up in the sheltering system. And 4 pets were rehomed to family and friends by the owners. So they were able to look after them. And both of these guys were folks who said, yeah, if I can't get this help, I'm really going to have to give up this pet. I can't keep this pet. Of the folks who were in the high end of that score, who rated a 6 to a 10, and said, yeah, I'm going to have to give up this pet, 93% still had their pet in the home. They're not significantly different. So even amongst the folks who weren't determined to take that pet home, they still were able to keep them. Did the services we provided help? 97% said yes. 3% said no, and that's because 3 said they were never intending to give up their pet. 1 said they might have to surrender because it was diabetic. And 1 felt that not much was done for him. So we're feeling pretty positive about our ability to help these people. So we had an open-ended question at the back, and we thought we'd get some criticism, we'd get some complaints, we'd get some comments, we might get some constructive feedback, but we got a lot of these amazingly positive comments back that just made us like go tingly and gushy all over. The service was very useful, quick, and everyone was very kind, and she recovered very quick. The service was excellent. I love the service that I received. I'm very happy and grateful. How am I able to make a donation? Everything was excellent. It brought a lot of happiness to me. I just want to let you guys know that I'm very grateful and thankful for your program. I would not have been able to keep him otherwise. So, there are some themes for rehoming. We've talked about those. Housing is a biggie, and medical care and treatment is another. Which ones are the driver depends on the location. So I've said this before, if you want to know what's going on in your community, you need to find out because it'll be a little different. LA is unique because of some of their laws, but there's probably other communities that have mandatory spay-neuter, and they may look different as well. The owners who are coming to the shelter, many of them are really loving owners. They really care about their pets. Their pets are very important, especially if you're living in systemic poverty and you're not really sure what's going to happen and nobody has really supported you your whole life. And many of the folks that we serve are from quite poor areas in the city. Having that pet greet you whenever you come home, having that pet not care, is just the sort of the cornerstone in your existence. They're so important. And these owners wanted to keep their pets. They are coming to ACC. They are coming to some of these programs when they know about it, specifically for help now, which to me is a really big shift. That's really important. And the nice thing is that while we haven't fixed housing yet, the medical stuff, we know how to fix that. We're wrestling a little bit when we're talking about chronic conditions like arthritis and skin stuff because we know those don't go away. How do we manage those in a sort of sustainable, cost-effective way? But there are still ways to do that. The diabetes dog, that's a challenge because that's insulin. But there are ways to do that. There are ways to manage diabetic cats without insulin if you need to. Heartworm, those kinds of things. There are ways to do that. The key is to be respectful and honest and open and have a conversation with people that's non-judgmental. And the nice thing is that I think in New England especially it's becoming clear that shelters are going to need to change who they are, what they do, and in many cases they are. They're starting to become resources for the community. And we're seeing that in New York City as well. And that's important because then they're not the dumping grounds. They don't have that terrible reputation, and people feel comfortable coming to them and saying, hey, can you help me with this? Or calling and saying, you know, my cat is clawing up my couch, what do I do? And that's a real shift for us. I think there's a lot of places in the country that are still working on that shift, but it's an important one, especially in New England, and to be thinking about in other places. There are some really cool programs out there where the way in which staff at shelters speak to the public is changed. They specifically said, you never say this, you always say it this way instead. And that way, it becomes a conversation, it becomes a partnership, and the shelter is no longer either the heavy or the bad guy, or, and the public isn't either. And it becomes a collaboration to help people and help pets. The articles that I talked about, this is a chapter, but the other things are published and they're here in the PowerPoint. So, and I think all of these are open access, not the chapter, but the articles are all open access, so they're easy to get. And I wanted to leave some time for questions, which I'm hoping people have. Yes?
So, based on this, I guess I'm kind of getting the impression that ASPCA has funding and the availability and is ready to help. It's just a matter of not getting enough clients.
So,
It sounds like you're having to help everyone and you're doing everything you can, but funding isn't an issue?
so yeah, so I think if I understand the question, it's the A is going in this direction, but what's stopping us from doing all the things we want to do, or is that?
Well, I got the impression that it was, you guys are doing as much as you can, but you're still trying to figure out how you can reach more people. And I was
Yes.
just wondering how the funding for that works.
Gotcha. Okay. So how can we reach more people, and how do we fund that? So yeah, you're right. We are funding most of this internally. It's part of our internal programming. And we're funding other people to do the work. We do a lot of that in LA and in other locations, and here as well. So there is a balance in that we can't help everybody, and we still want to expand who the animal welfare field supports, because there's still a lot of animals getting surrendered for housing reasons, for example. So we don't know how we're going to do that. We don't know how we're going to get people earlier. We don't know who we're going to partner with, and we don't know exactly how we're going to fund it. It's a good question. It's like when we did the NYPD partnership in New York City with the police department, we're supporting the care of the animals that are seized or that need help to stay in their homes. Some communities have those resources, some communities don't. It'd be great if we could get cities and municipalities to buy into the idea that people and their pets can use support. But we haven't been that successful in medical care or other kinds of social programming. So I don't know how successful we're going to be in doing this kind of work as well. Yes? Right. Yeah, so the question is about when you're running into housing issues, have the shelters themselves engaged in trying to work with landlords and other programs? In some cases, yes. In some cases, it's it's a little bit less one-on-one, but more like, here are pet-friendly facilities that you can go to, and here's things you can do to make your animal and your household more attractive to potential landlords, especially if you're talking private landlords. So, you know, we can give you the certificate that says your dog is vaccinated and spayed and neutered, and if you've taken him to a training class, then that's going to really make a lot of potential private landlords happier to see you. But that's been tough. We've talked about legislative issues, because in some cases there are actually housing regulations for a given apartment or public housing that are not really in compliance with what the legal requirements should be. And yet trying to legislate that or sue them nobody's been successful at finding the right case to make that. In some cases, it's insurance issues, because there may be worries about dog breeds. And so it varies a lot from place to place. And in some cases, it's just that people have very insecure housing, and they end up getting evicted without a lot of notice, and they show up at the shelter with all of their belongings and their cat. And you could have gotten them into a shelter that it took the cat if you'd known about it 3 weeks sooner. So it's a really complex piece, the whole housing piece, and I think people are trying a whole spectrum of different possibilities: legislative, educational, informative, but partly it varies from place to place, and partly we haven't found really, really good, solid ways to do it yet. We're talking about trying to dig in a little bit. We know that for some landlords, it's about money. So can we argue that if you're pet friendly and you have just certain kinds of screens, that you'll actually make more money because it turns out that those people are really great tenants to have, and they stay there a long time and there's not a lot of turnover. Maybe we can come at it from the money side. Oh, cool. Let me do this one and then we'll go to online. Great.
I was wondering how you would respond to someone in a professional manner if they told you that they don't believe people without money deserve to have pets.
Yeah, that's a hard one. So the question is, what do you tell people when someone says to you, people without money shouldn't have pets? And I guess I tend to be kind of pragmatic in that there is no way to ensure that. They will have pets. That's the practical piece. There's no laws. There are not going to be laws. Nobody's going to enforce those laws. So let's be pragmatic about it and say they have pets, and let's get past that piece and say, okay, how can we then help them be better pet owners? Because in some cases, they have no history of anyone in their family ever having been to a veterinarian. Some of the work we've done, we've talked to people, they don't know anyone who has ever gone to a veterinarian, and they're afraid, they don't know what to expect, they don't have a lot of money, and they don't know what to do. And if you sit and you talk to that person and you say, okay, when you go, this is what's going to happen, and this is what it will cost, and here's how it will be, they're like, oh, I can do that. And they go, and if they have a good experience with the veterinarian who talks to them like they're a real person, then they become a client who can come to you. They may not do the Cadillac version of treatments, but who will come into you, who will give that pet a lot of care, and who will do the best they can with what they have. Just as many people we might serve in those communities are living in places that we wouldn't choose to live, they might keep their pets in ways we wouldn't choose to keep our pets. I keep my cats indoors. Many of you probably do too, but I know people who think that's cruel. Am I going to tell them they're wrong? Well, I might, but. So I come at it from a very pragmatic perspective, that it's there, and I think it behooves us as veterinarians and animal welfare professionals to say, okay, this is reality, let's deal with it in as humane a way as we can. Online.
Okay. So for a small community, what might be the most powerful change a low-funded shelter can make?
For a small community, what might be the most powerful change a low-funded shelter might make? I would actually recommend that for a little while you talk to people and record why they're coming in and find out for your own location what are the barriers, what do people need, how can you help them. And we actually did this with a small grant program with five shelters around the country and said, here's how you can put, here's a really short three or four questionnaire. Do this, here's how you do it, and find out for your own community what it is. And that's what I would recommend, is to find out what it is, because in some cases it might be something really simple, and in some cases it might turn out to be something that's beyond the capability of that shelter, but it might be something that you might find a partner in social services with, or some other way to do it. So I think without knowing what the specific thing is, the big change is a philosophical one, and that is that people coming to your shelter want to do well and mean well, and that we should talk with them honestly and respectfully and find out what's happening and how we can help them, so that it becomes a relationship and a partnership to improve the welfare of that animal, which generally improves the welfare of the person too. What else?
Do you have multilingual resources available? If so, what? We have a large Spanish community where I am that would like to benefit.
So we have some of our stuff in Spanish. ASPCApro.org, which I didn't put a slide up, and I'll probably get chastised for that, has a lot of our shelter resources on it, and we do have some materials in Spanish. We also, the folks that we hire to do a lot of the outreach are multilingual, usually in Spanish because of the locations we're working in as well. So we're quite familiar with that. I don't know if we have online exactly what you're looking for, but that's a great place to look, as ASPCA Pro, and see what we've got. Anything else? What else? Yes. Yeah. Well, we haven't looked. I mean, we did do the rehoming survey was national, so we do have that. There are some cool programs in the Midwest. In Ohio, there's a great program called Revision in the Capital Area Humane Society, where they made that philosophical shift to we're working with people. They scheduled intake, but they do take people if they show up. We were there watching. And it's about this idea that people want to do the right thing. Let's give them the tools they need. And they have all kinds of resources. They have all kinds of conversations that are possible. And they've really empowered their staff to help the public. It's dropped their intake a lot. They actually tracked it, so we have really cool data that shows that the vast majority of these animals stayed in the home, and the ones that didn't were rehomed by the owner. Some came in, and they needed to come in, and then they have networks with their rescue groups for hard-to-place animals. So there is some stuff going on in the Midwest. Our footprints are more on the coast, so that's where we have more stuff that we've tracked. Yep. Yep. Yeah. I mean, we haven't dug in. I'm a little prejudiced. I was in Texas for many years. So we haven't dug into rural Texas or some of the rural South as far, because there's a lot of places there that are still struggling with just volume and other kinds of issues. But we're actually looking, we do a lot of relocation, and we're looking to do a lot of work now with our source shelters to see if we can get them to put themselves out of the relocation business by creating enough programming in their shelter, in their community, to handle the numbers of animals that are still coming in. And so we'll see how things go down there. My guess is we'll find the same things. Again, you know, the actual proportions of how many people want to keep their pet, how many don't. I'm not saying that there aren't occasionally people who really can't keep a pet or shouldn't keep a pet. There are people who should not keep a pet. But the majority of people that I think we historically thought were bad people for bringing their pet to a shelter and dumping it, I don't think that's really the case now. And whether it's truly changed or whether we've just recognized it as being different, I don't know. Yeah. So we haven't dug in a lot to where the animals came from per se. We hadn't found it very helpful because so many animals are coming from friends and family, and there's our sources where we don't have connections to those. Going to the fee issue at shelters, though, we do have several papers that have looked at waiving fees for cats. That's the species we looked at, where it shows that people who adopt from those fee-waived cats are just as attached to those animals. They keep them just as long. They have great experiences at the shelter. Because what you're doing, you're waiving the fees, you're not waiving your adoption process. You're still having a conversation with people, hopefully, and adopting a cat or a dog that's going to fit into their lives, and you're creating that relationship. They also tend to be more likely to come back and adopt another fee-waived cat. They take them to the vet just as often. All of those things that people might be concerned about. So it's sometimes a trigger for people to go and get a particular cat, or they feel like they're doing an extra good deed by getting a fee-waived cat, because many times those will be an adult cat who's been in the shelter a while who really needs to get out. But we don't find that fee waiving at all. That's one of those things where it does not seem to matter to people. As long as you have a good adoption process that helps people pick the right pet, it doesn't matter. People value those animals just as much. And for cats especially, and that's the species where we worry the most, I think. Yes? Yes, the surveys did look at education. The Los Angeles survey did. They all did, and we're not finding a lot popping out on education. So. Anything else? Yes. Right. Yeah, so the question is, have we looked at work where where pet owners have made some other kind of provision for what happens if they can't keep the pet anymore? And the answer is we haven't. There are a couple of programs around the country where if you have enough money, you can bequeath your pet essentially, and the pet will go there at your death or if you can't manage it anymore. Texas A&M I know has one, and there's a couple around. I think, yeah, a lot of the clientele that we're looking at don't have that wherewithal, because even their families and their friends, I think, people end up in jail or they end up losing housing or those kinds of things. But an interesting question. Yeah, that we haven't, the idea of helping people plan ahead for things that might happen is something we're sort of toying with this housing, cracking the housing nut of, well, what would I do if I lose my housing? Where could I put my pet? Who might be able to take my pet, and how could I help them hold that pet? Because we've looked at temporary boarding, and we are able to temporarily board these animals for people, but a lot of times we can't get them back to the people because they just can't get housing that will allow them to take the pet. So this sort of advanced planning is something we're playing with a little bit. Do we have time? Okay. Anybody have a last? Anyone else have a last? Okay. Relinquishment fees. These did not. We've looked at those, and it's not clear. It sounds to us like it. What happens is that when you institute it for like an owned animal, in the places where we've looked, then the stray numbers go up and the owned animal numbers go down. And it depends a little on how big it is, but it does make it harder. That feels like it's that is counter to the sort of philosophical shift that we're really trying to embrace. But yeah, people just work around it. Cool. Thanks, everybody.